Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 16 of my Lancastrians and Yorkists vlog. This time we've made it all the way to the Battle of Bosworth. We're going to be looking at the reasons that Henry VII is able to win that battle against Richard III and so become king. Now, we've not really mentioned Henry Tudor that much before, but suffice to say that's probably because his claim to the throne is pretty tenuous. Stick with me. Henry's mum was Margaret Beaufort, and her great-granddad, I think, was John of Gaunt, but via his mistress. So it's not a legitimate bloodline coming down from the king. John of Gaunt's dad was Edward III. So that through his mum, he does have royal blood, but it's pretty far-reaching. Also, and perhaps slightly closer, Henry's dad was Edmund Tudor, who was Henry VI's half-brother. So he was kind of Henry VI's nephew, but that was through Henry VI's mum, who had remarried after Henry V had died, and she had remarried Owen Tudor. So, yeah, in both cases, Henry Tudor is really low down the pecking order. But after the death of the princes and Buckingham and everyone else, he is the last claimant to the throne standing. And therefore, he kind of picks up the support of anyone who's looking for another option. And he's helped a lot by his mum, Margaret Beaufort, negotiating a marriage to Elizabeth of York, which you mentioned last episode. Elizabeth Woodville agrees to her daughter, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, to marry Henry Tudor, and that would, of course, boost his claim significantly, or certainly boost the legitimacy of his position on the throne if he gets there. Henry Tudor pledged to marry Elizabeth of York in December, in fact on Christmas Day 1483, while he was still in exile in Brittany. Now, worth a mention for Richard III's foreign policy. Oh, Richard. 1483, 1484, Richard embarked on quite an aggressive foreign policy, ordering naval attacks on France and Brittany and Scotland. Now, he soon pulls back on Brittany and Scotland and agrees a three-year truce in the autumn of 1484 with Scotland, and patches things up with Brittany because he realises at this stage that he needs to try and neutralise the threat of Henry Tudor. So he negotiates with Brittany over the handover of Henry Tudor, who had been there since 1471 when he'd unsuccessfully taken part in the attempt to reinstall Henry VI to the throne. Henry heard, however, that Richard was after him and escaped to France, maybe with the foreknowledge of the Duke of Brittany. We're not really sure. Certainly the Duke of Brittany allows his supporters to pop over the border and join him in France. And the French, of course, are still steaming from those naval attacks that Richard has unleashed on them. Possibly they are nervous about Richard down the track launching an invasion like his brother had in 1475. Certainly Edward's pro-Burgundian foreign policy and anti-French foreign policy probably still rang in their ears as a warning for what Richard could do and how it would be better to destabilise him and undermine him and just have a bit of fun at his expense, perhaps. Therefore, Charles VIII, who was only 15 at the time, obviously influenced by his advisors, very keen to support Henry Tudor and gave him money and ships and supplies and really everything he needed in order to launch an invasion towards England. Richard, of course, expected this and had some troops out on the south coast to try and deter it. And maybe because of that, Henry actually goes around to the west and landed on the tip of Wales in the summer of 1485 with between 2,000 and 4,000 soldiers, probably towards the smaller end of those, I reckon. These included experienced military commander John de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, who was a very important person to have on board because Henry Tudor himself was not very experienced at all in warfare. So Oxford is important to him. And Henry's uncle Jasper Tudor as well as another experienced military commander. And added to them about 400 other exiles. Most of the other troops are French mercenaries, but as they march through Wales, they do pick up further support on the way. And by the time they get to Bosworth, their army is probably about 5,000 soldiers strong. However, that's to be compared with Richard's army, which in total probably added up to about 12,000 soldiers. Although there is some controversy of that, which we'll come to in a minute. When he heard about the invasion, Richard was in Nottingham, and he may well have thought that Henry would be dealt with by Rhys ap Thomas in Wales. Rhys ap Thomas was the largest landowner in South Wales, but he decided to join Henry Tudor rather than defeat him. And then Richard might have expected Henry to have been dealt with by the Stanleys, but the Stanleys, again, more about them later on, decide not to stop Henry. And so he emerges, pops out of Wales and into the Midlands. And around that time, Richard gathers together his army and heads for Leicester. Records of the actual battle at Bosworth vary in what they say about what happened. But contemporary reports certainly say that Oxford was particularly important for Henry in his leadership in the battle. And on the other hand, Richard was quite badly let down by Percy, the Duke of Northumberland, who was in command of the reserves in the army and failed to commit them to battle at a crucial time. And also let down by the Stanleys, who had a sizable contingent of troops themselves. So let's talk about the Stanleys. They perhaps had 4,000 soldiers at Battle of Bosworth, although we're not clear about whether those are 4,000 out of Richard's army of 12,000 or in addition to. I think it's more likely that they're out of 12,000, and therefore by removing them from the battle, the armies become a bit closer in size to each other. William Stanley was Henry Tudor's stepfather. He had married Margaret Beaufort, but up till this point he had seemed to be a solid supporter of Richard, and he had been made Constable of England in place of Buckingham after Buckingham's revolt. And he had been trusted to keep Margaret Beaufort under house arrest after her actions in 1483. According to the Crowland Chronicle, though, Stanley had delayed joining Richard because he said he was sick. Always seems a bit suspicious. And it's been claimed also that Richard had taken Stanley's eldest son George as hostage to ensure that he played nice in the battle. In the battle, Thomas Stanley, Henry's stepfather, as I said, careful not to play any part at all. It's his brother, Sir William Stanley, who's also there with him, who joined in and gave Henry crucial assistance at the right time. That might well have been prearranged. Once he was king, Henry kept Thomas Stanley on as Constable of England, gave him other titles and lands. So clearly Henry found it very straightforward to forgive and patch things up with Stanley. Incidentally, as we'll probably hear about next time, Henry is less forgiving of Percy, who had let Richard down in the battle and saw that as being, just saw him being as less trustworthy, perhaps as a result. Which kind of indicates perhaps that the Stanleys were, at least had let it be known what they were going to do beforehand. And the Battle of Bosworth probably lasted between 2 and 3 hours, and all accounts agree that Richard fought very bravely. In fact, his body, when it was found in 2013, confirmed that he had suffered some severe head injuries, which is what had been said about in the reports. So, why did Henry win the Battle of Bosworth? Well, I think you can kind of split the reasons into 3. First of all, let's think about Henry before he even gets to the battle. He had spent a lot of his life in exile. He had limited support in England, a tenuous claim to the throne against Richard, who, by contrast, had been an important factor in England for ages, had considerable support in the north, if not the south, and definitely a closer claim to the throne, especially once those pesky princes were out the way. I would say, therefore, that foreign aid is crucial to getting Henry to the battle. Richard was really unwise to annoy the French, whose support, I think, was pretty critical in getting Henry over the Channel in order to pick up support. And it's noticeable that even by the time they get to Bosworth, Henry is not in a position to outmuscle Richard. It comes down to battlecraft and perhaps some bad luck during the battle. Even with that support of the French, without that support of the French, I don't think there was enough appetite to get Henry to that point. So that's point one. Secondly, it's kind of about the English support or lack of support for both sides, but particularly importantly for Richard. The Lancastrians contingent in England were still bitter about the Battle of Towton in 1461 and all that, which cuts a little bit of support away from Richard. The Woodvilles were not popular, and that cuts a little bit of support away. I would say that Richard's usurpation had splintered what was already quite a fragile coalition that Edward IV had put together. And then further, if we add to that, Richard's personal reputation, which was probably quite good before he usurped the throne, had been damaged by the Prince of the Tower and perhaps by the execution of Buckingham and Anthony Woodville and Lord Hastings before that as well. All that said, it's important to say that no English peers declared support for Henry Tudor before Bosworth. But I would go to Stanley and Percy as great examples of how support for Richard was superficial, ambivalent. They'll go along with him, but they won't back him wholeheartedly. Certainly, in both those cases, they're unwilling to fight for him. And then thirdly, I would say that during the battle, events conspire, or events pan out to give Henry the victory over Richard. So worth noting that Richard's army was bigger and fresher because it hadn't had to march as far. Richard had more cavalry, better artillery, and he himself had more experience than Henry as a commander. And he was there first on the actual battle site, so he had pick of the positions. He seems to have been well set up on Ambion Hill. That's in a good position. So again, everything kind of seemed set up for Richard to win. But in the battle itself, the turning point seems to have come when Richard felt compelled to make a move to attack Henry personally. Henry, perhaps going over to Stanley, seems to have detached himself perhaps away from the body of the the soldiers. It seems like at this point perhaps Percy wasn't committing his reserves, and Richard maybe felt under pressure to do something dramatic to win the battle. So he gallops over to Henry and wades right into the battle with relatively few supporters, about 100 or so probably. He actually got really close to Henry, and Henry's standard bearer was killed before Sir William Stanley arrived with reinforcements, and Richard was overwhelmed and killed. What this shows again, I think, is that the battle actually was probably really, really close, and Henry was under pressure, and his army was definitely kind of at a disadvantage. But it's that kind of moment where Richard saw an opportunity to finish it quick, and because of the lack of support or the ambivalence of the support, he felt he had to gamble, and therefore overreached himself, I would say, and that was the big turning point. So, in summary, French support crucial to getting Henry to the fight. The ambivalence of support probably crucial in putting Richard under pressure. But then thirdly, I would say even at that point, Richard's last minute rash decision to gallop into danger probably is what sealed his defeat at Bosworth. That's my analysis anyway. I hope you found it useful, and I'll see you next time when we'll start to get into Henry VII's reign.